Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you all the changes up to date that we are going to be receiving for Disc Priests and some of my thoughts on them and how the spec is taking shape in the 725 PTR. Alright, getting into it, of course, their main goal, and I want to kind of stress this before we get into everything, is they want to avoid, in their words, what is a degenerate playstyle that they have developed, where Disc Priests would ramp up to large and high amounts of atonement and basically be the burst, chunky AoE healer. They like that it's a niche, but they don't want it to be only with that. And they wanted to have, more options for priority targets to be healed. And they wanted to have the option for less atonements to be up, but for longer amounts. And in many cases, all right? That's more of a summation of a lot of the blue posts and a lot of the conversations that the devs have had, mainly with the player base. Now, that is their idea. Getting into it, of course, there's a couple spell modifier adjustments, a couple buffs here for Shadow of Pain, and they're also buffing Purge the Wicked as a result. So, slight damage increases here, nothing too crazy. They are removing the talent, the Penitent, and we'll go over all the talents. There's a big talent shakeup going on, but they're removing the Penitent, so of course, Penance will now just be able to be used on friendlies. The only time you'd really ever use that would be like in a PvE environment, would be like if you're running between Trash Pack and the tanks are like really low, but you're all wanting to run to keep on going through the instance. You could probably use it there. It'll be off cooldown by the time you get to the next pack, something like that. But generally speaking, you're never going to be using it on a friendly target in raid environments, in most environments for a dungeon or anything like that. Big changes here that we're going to be seeing with Plea. Rather than it increasing with in cost to the amount of atonements that you have, so you'd have to be using a weak aura or something along those lines to be checking how many atonements you have. It's just a flat amount now, and it's always going to be 1.8% of base mana. So it's pretty pricey for what it is, but it will allow the legendary Estelle, the legendary chest, that'll increase your haste based on your number of atonements once you use Plea. It will allow this legendary to be very, very powerful. And definitely move it from, the mediocre status it is to a very, very powerful legendary, because you will be not using Plea very frequently, but you'll certainly be using it a lot more often. You'll have a lot more flexibility for how often you want to be using it to be able to proc the extra haste out of it, and that'll be very, very powerful. If not all the time, but for a number of different fights. All right. Powered Radiance, of course, is receiving the biggest changes. It's going to hit now 5 allies total rather than 3. And it is going to be smart healing. All right, so it's going to be prioritizing targets who are low health or are likely to be taking damage, things like that. So the idea here is they want Disc to get a little bit better at spot healing specific targets. So in a fight like Star Augur, it can be kind of awkward in certain phases when you have multiple Frost debuffs out, and they want the Powered Radiance to automatically jump to those people more often than not, so that you can not have to worry about holding on to Powered Radiance or holding on to lots of atonements until you have like the Novas, which are really easy to heal up very rapidly as Disc, right? So they want to kind of have flexibility there. That's the idea behind it. Of course, the cast time is now 2 seconds, and there is a cooldown that is being added, and there are 2 charges. So it's an 18-second recharge, and you have 2 charges. And it's going to hit 5 targets and apply atonement for 60% of the normal duration of an atonement. Of course, Contrition is being removed, and originally Contrition was made baseline, and they wanted Power Radiance to be that flat amount there. Then they removed Contrition, so they just upped the amount or the duration of this atonement applied by Radiance just by a little bit, so they would always stay the same. Of course, Powered Shield is getting a mana cost increase. It's now 2.3% of base mana. Again, the way that they're kind of going about this is because Powered Radiance is getting a cooldown, Powered Radiance was really, the way you applied atonements was really the way that you were spending all your mana. And with this, it was making it so that, how much you could spam was around your Powered Radiances. Now they're saying, well, now that we've got a cooldown to it, how are we limiting Disc Priest mana? Because they don't want anybody to have unlimited mana. So that's why they're adding these higher mana costs to Plea and to Powered Shield to kind of provide a sort of limiting factor to that. So, going into Smite, Smite's getting a spell power increase for just the extra amount of damage that it's going to be dealing. Going into Power Barrier, of course, has a little bit of a radius that's going to be increased just by a little bit. And, of course, it costs a little bit less mana. It's really nice that it's costing less mana because something like that is just exceptionally expensive. Getting into the talents, and this is probably the biggest thing that's happening right now. Of course, I mentioned Contrition's being removed. Divine Star and Halo have a little bit of a mana cost adjustment, but they're not really too crazy. And Shadow Covenant got a nice little buff here. Again, nothing too wild, but what I want to get into how the talents are now being sorted, because there's a very, very big change, and I definitely want to kind of get your eyes on this as fast as you can for what they are going to be mixing around with our talents here. So, of course, in the 15 tier, we have Twist of Fate being moved in, and, of course, Castigation and Schism stay the same. The one that was removed here was the Penitent. The 30s and 45s are unchanged. 60s are unchanged as well, so you don't have to worry about these 3 sets changing much on you. But 75, 90, and 100 are all getting big changes. So Sanctuary is a new talent. Basically, the Smite Absorb effect is increased by 50%, I should say. Then you have Clarity of Will, which has always kind of been the black sheep and still not really finding a place to be used, but it's getting moved into 75. And of course, you have Shadow Covenant moving down from the 100 tier into the 75. And of course, that got a little bit of a light buff there. So what we're seeing now is Purge the Wicked getting moved to the 90 tier. Divine Star and Halo are still there as they usually are. Of course, 75 tier got probably this one of the most shakeups, and then Power Infusion is now getting moved from that 75 tier alongside Grace and the new talent Evangelism. So Evangelism is on a 1 minute cooldown, extends the duration of all of your active by 8 seconds, and basically this is Flourish. It is actually about the exact same thing. It's in the exact same slot for just another healer class, and it basically is Flourish for Disc Priests. A lot of people have, in my opinion, given fair criticism that they're kind of forsaking a lot of the values or the experience for Disc Priest, the uniqueness of Disc Priest, to kind of get a quick fix in for Disc to make it more competitive, more popular, just for the rest of the expansion, even at the sacrifice of that class fantasy that they love so much in early alpha and beta development. So they're adding something that is basically a cookie cutter of some other talent for some other spec that's not supposed to be anything like a priest. You're taking some druid ability and you're putting it right into a Disc Priest. Doesn't seem to work that well. If you're trying to mix up like, oh, Holy and Disc both have Halo, Divine Star, well, that makes sense. You can share some abilities there. But you're having something that basically is a cookie cutter coming out of another class. Feels kind of bad. And I can understand where people are coming from when they're saying that they're really not a big fan of it. In terms of gameplay, though, this is a tremendous buff. And it's going to be extremely vital to your raid healing to be taking Evangelism as often as you possibly can. Many of the raid builds that I was seeing off of PTR testing would kind of vary with Shield Discipline versus Mindbender. Usually people were running Mindbender, or I saw a lot of people running Mindbender, just because they were not pushing far enough into like Mythic PTR testing because they weren't expecting a kill. So they're getting, 2 to 4 minute pulls at most, rather than, 5, 6, 7 minutes for some of these bosses that it would take to actually die if they're on live servers. So I saw many going on Mindbender, but I believe Shield Discipline still will be the higher mana value. And then, of course, I was seeing many people testing out Twist of Fate, Castigation, and Schism, actually, as well, to kind of decide of how much mana they could do. Of course, with Schism as well, you're really balancing a lot of different cooldowns around each other. With the Powered Radiance cooldown, with your Evangelism cooldown, and then you're frequently using your Schism as well as Powered Shield, Penance, all kinds of other stuff going on. So I think a lot of people are taking Castigation. I believe Castigation, and it may depend on the fights as well, how low people can drop for Twist of Fate, because Twist of Fate can be extremely valuable. But it will kind of vary from here. But in terms of my testing, my PTR testing, I was usually taking Castigation or Twist of Fate for kind of ease of access and kind of bouncing between the two. I'll have the full guide out, of course, when 725 drops, when there's no other crazy changes going on. All right. But of course, the interesting thing about this is actually the flexibility that you're getting out of this talent tree. I was kind of talking about earlier where Shadow Covenant actually gets a place here. If you were going to play, a very safe build for Mythic Plus or something like that, being able to run Shadow Covenant, being able to run Grace is actually going to be immensely powerful for a number of instances, especially when you have any kind of large AoE damage. For example, if you're in like Court of Stars and you're saying, oh, okay, we'll just muscle through the enforcers who are going to just be pulsing the group and they're going to be putting a dot on them. Well, it's really hard to actually deal with that when you don't really have any kind of AoE healing that is not based on you hitting something. So if all the other targets are dead and then you're stuck there trying to heal up that debuff with just Shadowmans alone, it makes it pretty rough. If you're able to use something like Shadow Covenant Grace, it helps out quite a bit. And can definitely be that kind of flexible ability, especially because it is instant cast, it is an AoE heal, and it can be very, very powerful for you. So this will, at worst case, it'll provide flexibility. I'm not saying you're always going to be running this talent, but the fact that you're getting the flexibility here will make it really, really powerful, and it's just more options. And I think that's a very, very nice thing. It is kind of sad that in an earlier iteration they had Power Infusion still at the lower tier, in the 75 tier, so you can actually still take Power Infusion and Evangelism at the same time. That was something that many people were seeing that could be very, very desirable, but they didn't want those two to be the auto picks, the always take, so they kind of put them in the same tier together. For raids though, and I was actually talking to Suplift about this and kind of engaging some of his thoughts, and one of the biggest things that kind of stuck with me that he said, you know, the healing that you're doing within your Evangelism window is far more important than what you're doing without. And by the time I got to take a look at his logs and get my own experience in PTR, it was really kind of standing out where even though the dev's goal was just to kind of push us further and further away from this super heavy burstiness, we actually saw it more and more where we just continued to be bursty healers. And discontinued to be bursty healers just in a bit of a different way. Now, we are able to use a lot more Shadowmen than we have in the past, because Shadowmen is becoming a lot more valuable than Plea in many instances. If you're able to get the heal off of Shadowmen, and if you are not on the move or anything else like that that you have to worry about, Shadowmen will be something that you can be using in between your Power Radiance cooldowns. Plea use sparingly because it will be very, very expensive, and unless it's going to be healing, a target with heavy atonement healing or something like that, it's not going to be that valuable. So you'll still be kind of limited to how much Plea and by that measure spend that you'll be able to use, but you probably will see them a lot more frequently than you have in the past, and those will begin to be mixed in a little bit more than they have in the past. So you're getting into a position where Disc still is going to be focused on that burst healing, but you kind of sort of have a few more options here. And if anything, it will be more beneficial for the sustain, and it'll be a little bit easier, I think, for most people to kind of wrap their heads around it with it. It'll be a little bit easier for people to wrap their heads around the spec in general, because they'll have Evangelism there, which can always act as sort of a backup. If you mess up, if there's something going wrong, if you ramped up too early, used your Powered Radiances too early, Evangelism is kind of there to be that backup. It's not going to be the optimal way to do it, of course, but when you have an ability that has the flexibility to kind of save you from your screw-ups, or further enhance somebody who is well prepared, that's a great talent to have, and that's something that's great for the gameplay of it. If you're trying to get more than, I believe it's 3 or 4% of the healer mythic rating population playing this spec, adding talents in, and even though it is at the sacrifice of, some of the class fantasy, some of the uniqueness, and you're getting more homogenization, if you're able to get the spec into a more playable position for more people, or just more attractive for people to play it, then it can be quite powerful. Hope you guys enjoyed this quick rundown of Disc Priest and some of my thoughts on it, some of my thoughts on the changes, of course. I'll give you guys, there'll be another video coming up to give my thoughts on PTR and just the more specific gameplay stuff that we'll be seeing. And of course, I will have a full up-to-date guide for 7.2.5 when it does drop, alright? Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoy it, and I'll catch you all next time.